think so. I believe so. Hang on, let me check. Yes, we are happening. Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good God. Here we are again. Darlings, hamburgers, other lovely things. Very nice to have you with me. I'm Tad. I will be here until the clock on the clubhouse wall says it's time to go, but it's not time to go yet. That's not what the clock on the clubhouse wall is saying. Clock on the clubhouse wall is saying it's 1 a.m. California time, which is where I am. So right now, as far as I'm concerned, that's what time it is. You guys can have your own time depending on where you are. I'm not picky about that. But don't confuse me. I'm still struggling with the concept of daylight savings time, which we're not in at the moment. So I think I'm pretty darn sure we're in Pacific Standard Time. Pretty darn sure. So hello, good to see you all. Nice to be here. Nice to still be alive. As you can see, I'm still in the replacement office for at least another week or so. As I think I mentioned last week, we've sort of had to put back the official full-blown moving date, but we're still in the process. As a matter of fact, we were in the process deeply today, and some of our young people are moving to their apartment, and there were people in and out of the house, and I want some credit for this, okay? I don't set myself up for praise very often, okay? I'm not a glutton for people telling me. I'm not like a certain former president. I don't have to be praised. I don't have to be lionized or anything like that. But I want some praise for this. I actually wrote 9 flippin' pages of original material today with a small dog, very small dog. He's tiny. But anyway, a very small dog with a very loud voice sitting on my lap most of the time going, making these horrible noises. Because at that point in time, he was locked in here with me and didn't know where anybody else in the house was. And of course, despite the fact that I've been feeding him for years and taking care of him and was the person who first picked him out from the foster service and brought him or had them bring him to us, and in other words, am the founder of his entire life since he was a little lost on the street dog. Despite that, he cannot stand being with me, only me, even on my lap, even being petted, and has to whine, shrill, yelp for literally 2 hours while people are moving things up and down the hallway and walking in and out and stuff like that. Somehow I managed to write a good 8 or 9, maybe 9 or 10, but I don't know, somewhere around there, number of pages today. And that is not easy. I'm sorry, it's not easy. It's hard enough writing a sensible 8 or 9 or 10 pages at the best of times, but with a tiny, tiny little insect of a dog sitting on your lap, squealing like a crucified mouse, it's even more difficult. So by God, I deserve something. If this was the old days of Marvel Comics, I would deserve a no prize at the very least for that. Anyway, let me see who might have checked in here and I can say hello to. I see, Ilva must have checked in because I see Petra saying hello to her. So hello, Ilva. Good to see you, darling. Hello, Petra. A pleasure. Christy, nice to have you. Sandra. Sarah Lena Sefina Folkmarsson, yeah, those Walter's noises were not that cute. Anyway, let me see who else has checked in here. Sean has checked in. Hello, Sean. Good to see you. Chris, Wouter, Anamika, Dirk, Iris, Jeremy, Hertie, Rosalba, and Christy already said hello to Olaf. Hello, Olaf. Long time no see, buddy. Nicole, Mark, Penny, Nikki, just to name a few. So very good to see you all. I hope I caught everybody who has posted anything. I never have any idea how many people are actually listening because I refuse to look at the thing that says how many eyes are on at the time, because it always makes me feel like so few. After all of my life and all of my work and all this, but as I often said, I've done book signings with very few people showed up, especially early in my career. And one of the things that I learned early on is, if you're doing a reading or a book signing or something like that, and not a lot of people show up, um, it's not the fault of the people who showed up. In fact, they did show up, and they should be praised and honored for that. So whenever in the past I've had and it happens to everybody, even extremely old veteran writers like me. You go to a convention or something and you have a panel and only like 5 people show up. This kind of stuff happens. And, I always make sure that, you treat 5 people like 50 or 500. So even though we do not have a huge crowd for these readings, that's all right. I don't blame anybody. And I certainly value the people who do show up, especially since most of you show up week after week, which may make me question your sanity or at least your leisure time activities. But I'm very grateful for it. It's nice at this stage of things to know that somebody cares. And that's all that really matters. And I care. I care, and I care about you guys, and I'm grateful for you. So thank you all, and I'll try to remember to check back in. Anything else to talk about? No. Oh, well, except I'm wearing my Norn Porn shirt. This is in honor of a dear friend that we all miss very much, Cindy Yan, who was just very important to a lot of things, not only many of the online TAD-centric or TAD-related groups. Cindy, under the name Cyan and Blue, contributed a great deal to those, and she contributed hugely to our merchandising thing when Deb was doing merch, but also just as a friend, as a person that we cared about and loved and lost. So even before this last year of god-awful things happening, that we have suffered losses in the past, all of us. Everybody who was friends with Cindy miss her very much. And Norn Porn was sort of her favorite joke. And she was actually one of the people who was involved in making these shirts. So we miss you, Cindy. We do. Anyway, so what else was I going to talk about? Not really much. And there's Ron. Hello, Ron. Good to see you too. And anyway, this has always been one of the things that's super important to me. And I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. I don't remember why. Maybe I was talking to you guys last week. But anyway, there was some point where I was talking about the fact that I've had the same publisher for years. I've had the same agent for years. And the older I get, and I am getting older, we all are, so don't think that you're off the hook, but, some of us are a little further along the road. The one thing that becomes more and more clear to me, or more obvious to me as I get older, is that the world is full of people, and it's really, it's the ones that stick with you and you stick with them that it's really important to hang on to. And whether that be your family or your created family or just your close friends, whatever you want to call it, however it is, I've been very lucky in this life. I have friends that I've known since childhood. I have friends that I've made through my writing. I have friends that I've made through my wife, Deborah, who brought a whole new group of people into my life. And, there's just so many people that I've met that I wished I had the time to get to know, because they're clearly really cool people. But I've also realized that if you try to spread yourself too thin, at a certain point, you're not really doing your best for the people that you have held closest or who have been the most important to you. And I say this not to diss anybody or anything, but I really value the people who who show up for these readings and constantly have kind things to say and all that. It's not the kind things, although I don't mind those at all. Nobody does. And I don't mind the fact that most of them are readers and seem to like my work, although again, that's not something I've got a problem with at all. I really like it. But just it's the consistent contact with nice people, with smart, kind people is really one of the things that, that keeps us all going. So when I give my little end of the reading spiel and I'm talking about taking good care of the people who are close to you and the people around you, I really believe in that. I think it's super important. I think that, I don't remember who said it. Maybe it was Einstein, maybe it was Kurt Vonnegut, I don't know, one of those smart people that said, my religion is kindness. And that's pretty darn close. That's pretty darn close to how I feel about it. We could all do more for each other, but as long as you're trying, that's what matters. So anyway, end of sermon. I don't know what got me off on that. Just my normal blathering. Anything else to report? Now we're still in the middle of stuff. I'm dealing with work stuff, and of course we're dealing with the move, and Deborah in particular worked really hard today packing and boxing things up. I will avoid the usual snide husbandly comment about the fact that she's got so much more stuff than I do, that there's a lot more to be gathered up. But in truth, she was doing heroic work all day, and stuff that belongs to all of us, kitchen stuff, just stuff, not just her own stuff by any means. And so she is in sleeping the sleep of the just and the hardworking right now after putting in a very full day. I cannot claim the same except for writing while holding a tiny little shrill rat-like creature for several hours. But anyway, it was in part because Deb was doing all that other work that I could actually get on with finishing some writing. Okay, anything else to report? Not much, really, honestly. I'm going to have to come up with some news for one of these shows sometimes, or for one of these readings. Sorry, the show, I keep saying shows, but that's because I used to do radio shows. And that's always in the back of my mind, especially when I'm just talking too much. That's like my radio days all over again. And I tend to think of them as shows, whereas this is really just a reading, I'm not singing, I'm not dancing. Anyway. So, anything else that needed to be talked about? No, it's weirdness season, and not just because of the move, but because we're also saying goodbye to my parents' house. And that's been one of the strange things for me, is living in my parents' house, is that it is my parents' house. I grew up here. I lived here from age 3 till 18 or so. But it was their house then for 40 years more after that or whatever. And so unlike Deb, who loves being here and stuff like that, I've always felt kind of like I don't really belong here anymore. This is not my home. It hasn't been my home for decades. It was my parents' place. But anyway, since we are in the process of moving out, and then the family is going to wind up selling the house, I also have these moments where, we're going through things, we're running across stuff with my parents. Anybody who has lost a family member and had to do this knows exactly what I'm talking about, that part of it. But it's also the sense of just, of like it's time to say goodbye. I walk out in the front porch or the back door and, I look out on the place where I grew up and where I played as a kid and, where all the houses have names attached to them of people who are long gone. But in my mind, that will always be, the Bell's house, the Erickson's house, the Fishman's house, this kind of thing, even though it's been 40, 50 years since most of those people were here. It's going to be strange just to know that somebody else will be living here after all these years, that not just that, but who knows what will happen. They may tear the whole house down. That happens a lot in Palo Alto. It's a nice little house, but it's not one of these McMansion type things like people are building all around. It's a nice house. And I hope somebody nice buys it, because this has always been a nice neighborhood for us, and we have a lot of very powerful positive feelings about it. And of course, we know a lot of the neighbors, even before we moved back here to live for however long it's been now, 8 months or something. And so we hope that whoever has the house next will be nice people. My parents were really nice people, and I can't tell you how many people came up and said, "Oh my gosh, we're so sorry. Your parents were, they were the heart of the neighborhood." And I know that. I know that because they were always that way. Everywhere they went in their lives, they were trying to do something good and have fun, and they both had a great sense of humor, which I owe them for. Not saying that mine is great necessarily, but certainly my appreciation of a sense of humor is very strong. And in fact, most of my good friends, one of the reasons they became friends in the first place was because they made me laugh. That's a hugely important thing, whether in a spouse, a partner, a best buddy, they got to make you laugh. I mean, if not, you're not on the same wavelength, really. At least I don't think so. Anyway, enough babbling. I am going to go back to the book, but first I'm going to check and see if there's any other folks that Andre has shown up. All right, good. All right, good to see you, Andre. And come on, where did you go? Why are you not giving me the comments? There we go. Okay, so have I got everybody here? James! No, I hadn't said hello to James. So now I remedy that. Hello, James. Okay, well, I can't tell how many other people I might have missed, so I apologize for not getting anybody that I should have gotten. But y'all know, I'm sure, that you are valued. By the way, I am somebody, even though I say y'all all the time, and I know some people are kind of like, somebody blah, 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 like him, he's a Californian, he's college educated, sort of. I dropped out. That y'all is an affectation. No, it's not an affectation. I had a Southern grandmother, and that was a phrase I learned when I was really little. It would have been after age 3, because that's when she became my grandmother on my dad's side. But I definitely picked up y'all from having a Southern family, and they were very Southern, my dad's family. Not my dad, but his parents, his family, the whole milieu were transplants from Memphis. But that's a whole other story. One interesting thing, though, is that my great-grandfather, anyway, one of my relatives on my dad's side they were wealthy in that point. They then later on were not wealthy, but at that point they were quite wealthy, and he built perhaps the ugliest house that has ever been in the state of Tennessee. It was the Napoleon Hill Mansion. And if you look it up sometime and find it was just, God, I mean, even the Addams family would have kind of blanched and turned away. It was just terrifying. So that's like one of my family's attenuated claims to fame, is we built probably the weirdest house that ever was revealed in Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, so I've babbled enough. I was going to read, and I am going to read. That's what I'm going to do. So here we go. We are returning to the Witchwood Crown. And last time, if you will recall, Simon, Miriam L., Morgan, the whole crew were with their troops, and they had surrounded an unknown number of Norns. Well, we know it was actually a very small number of Norns. It was 5 Norns, plus a giant, plus Jarnulf. And then during the course of the night, in the middle of the night, the giant and the Norns busted out. And during the course of that, the young harper Renan was killed, and Simon was only barely saved from being killed by the giant because Jeremias, his old friend, and the Lord Chamberlain, actually came and grabbed him and knocked him down before the giant could knock his head off with a club. So that's the last thing that happened, and I'll read that last 2 paragraphs there. This is Simon talking. "Jeremias?" he asked. Jeremias had his arms wrapped tight around Simon's knees. It seemed so unlikely, like another part of the dream. The king's oldest friend had grabbed him and dragged him down so that the giant's blow had missed. "God's blood, Jeremias, you saved my life!" His friend stared back at him for a moment, his bloodless, shocked face covered in dirt and ashes. Then Jeremias Chandler, Lord Chamberlain of the Hayhold, burst into helpless tears. Count Aelair knew that the gods had gifted him with life and vitality beyond many, and he was grateful for that. At an age when most men were dead or doddering, he still moved among the greatest and the most powerful of all lands, and had responsibilities that any ambitious man would envy. Instead of sitting in the sun or playing with grandchildren before the hearth, he spent his days in the saddle with the young men and worried at night about the fate of entire kingdoms. But in this hour he felt truly old, older than he had ever felt. It was as though the previous night had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a fragile shell, as if any sharp blow or even a hard breeze might crumble him into flakes and powder. "Just tell us the worst of it." Queen Miriamel was composed, the only sign of her misery in the redness of her eyes. For an instant he thought he saw in that sharp, stubborn face what her father, Elias, might have been had he not been lured by the priest Priorides, had he not fallen into madness and shadows. "How many dead?" "It makes my heart ache to tell you, Majesty. 23 men dead, but with several others not likely to last the day. Twice that number hurt. Colfer will lose his arm, but he was lucky. The man beside him was crushed like a rotten fruit." Aelair shook his head. "Forgive me, Majesties, you do not need to know all the horrors this day has seen." "Of course we do," she said. "In fact, I will go visiting with you when we have finished here. The king has been wounded, so he can wait to go among them until tomorrow." "That's foolish. I'm scarcely hurt, Miri," Simon said, but to Aelair he seemed worse than hurt. If the queen looked like she had been crying, Simon looked like someone who could not even remember how to cry, as though something important inside him had collapsed and might never be rebuilt. He could certainly understand why the queen didn't want Simon going out among the men yet. Still, there was no way he could tell that to the king. "Rest and let the queen visit the men, sire," he said. "I will bring your commanders here, and you can take stock with them." "Take stock? What is there to discuss? A handful of white foxes just killed 24 of our people. One of them right in front of me. Right in front of me." Simon took a long time before speaking again. "An innocent. God save us all." "We must discuss whether we send a troop of men after the enemy for one thing," Aelair said. "Pointless." The king shook his head. "They would be hard enough to catch on foot, but on those tireless stormspike horses, there's no sense in even following. Believe me, if I thought otherwise, I'd be leading the way myself." "No, you wouldn't," his wife said. "Do not even speak that way." "Why?" The king grimaced and rolled into a more comfortable position on the cot. "I took no real injuries." Simon pointed at Tiamat, who was rolling his cutting instruments back into their oilcloth wrapping, preparing to go out among the wounded again. "Ask him." Tiamat turned and nodded wearily. "The king is bruised and scraped, and his ribs are tender. But yes, his Majesty is largely correct." He shared a quick glance with Aelair before turning to the king. "Still, you are terribly weary, Simon. I've already slept. The rest of you haven't." The king had been all but tricked into an hour's worth of rest around dawn, after Tiamat, at Aelair's quiet suggestion, had insisted that the shocked, heart-sick monarch down a cup of strong Pedruanese brandy. "I can't lie around any longer when the men are hurt and frightened, and many are dead. You already stopped me from going among them once." "They didn't need to see you like that, husband," the queen said. "You would have brought them no comfort. Bleeding and filthy, you looked like some monster yourself." The king was now almost sulking. "Only because Jeremias pulled me down into the muck. When he saved me, of course. Saved my life. I don't want to sound ungrateful. Bless him and keep him. I couldn't believe it when I looked down. And..." Simon trailed off and looked around. Eolair politely waited for him to catch up. "Your pardon," he said. "What else is there? Why were those creatures here, so far south?" Eolair could only shake his head. "At this point we can but guess, Majesty. No, I do not think we're even ready to do that." "And has anyone found evidence of how many of the evil things there were?" Miriamel asked. "Did we kill any?" "If we did," said Tiamat, quietly, as was his usual way, but with unusual firmness, "I would very much like to see the body." "None." Eolair spread his hands. "We found no fallen but our own. Apparently the 5 we saw, and the giant, of course, were all..." "They are terrible, fierce fighters," said Simon. "Cold and difficult to kill as snakes. I truly hoped we would never have to face them again." A herald appeared in the doorway of the tent and announced Sir Kenric, the burly, bearded young captain marshal who held one hand close to his side. Eolair stirred, wondering if the captain was injured. The way he kept the hand out of sight made Eolair anxious, and he took a few steps closer to Kenric and let his hand fall discreetly to his sword hilt, wondering if he still had enough of his old speed should something be badly amiss. "Captain, what do you have there for us?" he asked. "Any sign of the bastards?" the king called from his cot. "Gone, sire," said Kenric. "Melted into the open lands on the other side of the road. You'd think the Huna would leave an easy track to follow, but there are a lot of rocky stretches in the grassland here. I'd warrant they're on their way back to Stormspike, heading due north." He raised his hand to his chest. "But I beg your pardon, Majesties. As the Lord Steward noticed, I have something else to show you. I sent men sweeping both ways up and down the road, looking for other enemies. I told them especially to look for any sign of recent activity, something that might suggest another ambush. They saw nothing of that, but they did come across this, a short way down the road to the south, sticking right out of the mud. The man who found it said it looked at first like a spring flower." He carefully offered the thing he had been cradling to the queen. It was an arrow, but not one of the Norn's black shafts. It looked like mortal work, and made in haste at that, the rawhide cord irregular where it wrapped the arrowhead, as though a broadhead from one arrow had been used to repair a different one. But what was most unusual about it was the roll of blood-smeared parchment wrapped around the shaft and tied tightly with another rawhide thong. Miriamel looked it over. "You said this was found close by? In the road? It certainly doesn't look to be one of ours." "No, Majesty," said Kenric. "It looks like the arrow of someone who's been living rough," said Eolair. "And it isn't the first. We found several more like this one on the hill this morning, but only sticking in trees. As far as we could discover, not a one of these hit any of our soldiers. All those who had been shot, it was Norn arrows that pierced them." "Unpeel that bloody hide," said Simon. "What is it?" Eolair took his knife and handed it to the queen. She cut the thread and unwound it, then unfurled the hide so carefully and gently that Simon groaned at how slowly she did it. This was the first thing that had happened since the previous day that even came close to making Eolair smile, but he still did not feel solid enough for that. Whatever was holding him together seemed more fragile than even that slender rawhide cord. "What kind of letters are those?" the queen asked, holding up the latticed hide. Untidy rows of strange characters filled it, drawn in black. "Aelair, can you read this? Tiamat?" Aelair had seen things like it, but could not remember where. He shook his head. "I can, Majesty," Tiamat said. "Or at least I think I can." "Is it Ranaman writing, then?" Simon asked in surprise. "That would be a strange turn." "No, sire." Tiamat took the hide from the queen, then squinted as he tilted it toward the nearest torch. "These are the runes that Rimmer's men once used." Simon squinted and frowned. "That doesn't look like Rimmersback." "It is, but the runes are different. I said once used. These are the old signs, the ones they brought from their former land across the Sea of Icebergs. Only the Black Rimmer's men still use them in Ostenard now. The Norn's slaves." "But why would 4 or 5 Norns have a slave?" Aelair asked. "So far from their border? It makes little sense unless one of the White Foxes was some kind of royalty." He turned to Tiamat. "Can you read what it says?" "As I said, this language is old, Rimmersback, the ancient version of what I learned. I will try to make what I can of it." It took him a little while. As Tiamat puzzled through possible meanings, Binnabik came in from the cold morning to say that the last of their rams had been found, which meant that even the 4-legged members of the troll's own small party had survived. When he saw what the Ranaman was doing, he leaned close to look over his shoulder. "It is not being much like the Rimmersback I can read," the troll admitted. "I think I have the sense of it now," said Tiamat, looking down to the translation he had written on a parchment. "I travel with the Hikedaya," it says. "I am not one of them, but I will stay with them. This is what I must do. They travel on a mission to Ermsheim. I do not know why, but the mission is important to Nakiga. The queen of the Hikedaya has awakened from her long sleep. The north is full of rumor and preparation for war. I heard one of this company say that the queen seeks the Witchwood crown. I do not know what that means, but it is important to them. What I do know is that the Queen of the North lives again, and while she lives, she plans our deaths." Tiamat cleared his throat. "It is signed Jarnulf of the White Hand." Aelair suddenly felt as if something was shifting beneath him. Not a fixed, solid thing like rocks and earth, but a tangle of plans and assumptions that had seemed strong enough to bear them up only a few short hours before. Queen Miriamel looked as troubled as Aelair felt. Strange and frightening. "Do you know who this Jarnulf is, Count Aelair? Kenric? Have any of you heard of him or this White Hand?" As heads were shaking, Sir Kenric held out his hand again. "Also we found this, which was lying near the arrow. It seems to have fallen loose when the arrow struck the ground. My man said he thought by the angle it had stuck in the mud that the arrow must have been fired from high up on the hillside." The captain opened his hand, exposing a shiny something on a slither of silver chain. "He who always steps on sand!" Tiamat cried, an oath Aelair had only heard the little man use when he was badly surprised. Coming forward to look more closely, the count saw it was a circle of silver dangling from a silver chain. A silver feather was laid across the circle, along with another shape Aelair could not make out. This is the sign of the League of the Scroll, Tiamat said hoarsely. But ours are gold, not silver, and there has never been any Jarnulf in the League. King Simon stared at the silver charm, then swung his feet off the cot and turned to the hand of the throne. Eolair sighed, foreseeing what was to come. Old friend, Simon told him, this attack, all of this, well, it changes things. Eolair felt no surprise, only a small sadness. Yes, sire, of course it does. I will tell my great-nephew Aelin that I cannot go back with him to Ernest Adhark. Give me time only to write a letter to Queen Inawin. Of course, of course. But something in the king's face said that even this morning's discoveries, strange and ominous as they were, excuse me. But something in the king's face said that even this morning's discoveries, strange and ominous as they were, had not disturbed him like the death of the young harper, nor could much distract him from it. Yes, I'm sorry, but that's it, old friend. We can't do without you. Not now. Of course, sire. I understand. And in that moment, Eolair was not really certain that any such ordinary plans or frustrations mattered. It seemed the shift of balance he had sensed earlier had been just a hint of something even larger, a great and heavy pivot that would change the world so much that no matter what they did, its full force would soon be upon them. Part 2. Orphans. Heaven took my wife. Now has also taken my son. My eyes are not allowed a dry season. It is too much for my heart. I long for death. When the rain falls and enters the earth, when a pearl drops into the depths of the sea, you can dive in the sea and find the pearl. You can dig in the earth and find the water. But no one has ever come back from the underground springs. Once life is over. Once gone, life is over for good. My chest tightens against me. I have no one to turn to. Nothing, not even a shadow in a mirror. Mei Yao Chen. Chapter 24. Terrible Flame. In the wild lands north of Quanitapool, the swamp called the Varn stretched in a broad tongue of wet lowland all the way to the shores of the Unhav, the wide lake that the city people of Naban called by a name in their own language, Eadni. The Grasslander riders knew this northernmost part of the Varn well. In spring and summer, the people of the Thrivings hunted here for birds and fish and otters, whose pelts the stone dwellers prized and paid for handsomely. So the Grasslanders had learned the safe ways through this treacherous, trackless landscape while they had still been children. Why do the city men even come to live here? Framer asked. They are not like us, or even the Varna men. They will be eaten by crocodiles or gants. They will stumble off the safe tracks and drown. Only a few of them, said Unver. Then the rest will drain the Varn and build farms. Framer hoped that wasn't true, but he had learned long ago not to argue with Unver. The tall, quiet man did not say much, but what he said was usually correct. Impossible, said Odrig, Framer's brother, who was the thane of their clan, even though their father still lived. Only a coward would believe that stone dwellers could take our land. We will push them into the ocean. Only a coward or a fool, said Drojan, looking to Odrig for approval. Unver did not say anything, and his hawk-nosed face remained impassive. But Framer could almost feel the man's anger tighten, like the stretching of a bowstring. Unver thumped his heels against his horse's ribs and rode a little way ahead, picking his way through the tufts of reeds and the muddy pools on ancient tracks that would disappear again with the first rains of autumn. "Fool," said Trojan again, but not as loudly as he might have. Like Odrig, Trojan was barrel-chested and strong, but though Odrig might be as tall as Unver, Trojan was a head shorter and a great deal slower. If Trojan had not been Thane Odrig's friend and lackey since childhood, Framer felt sure he would not be insulting Unver so freely. Odrig laughed. "No need to pick fights," he said. "There will be blood to spill soon enough." Framer was not entirely certain himself how he felt about Unver. The tall man was no one's friend, and he had made it clear many times that he thought Framer little more admirable than his elder brother Odrig. Still, there was something about pale-skinned Unver that Framer could not ignore. Some quality of purposeful reserve, of unusual thoughts unshared. Old beyond his 3 decades, uninterested in boasts or contests or drinking until he staggered, Unver was simply not like the other Thriving's men. If Framer was uncertain of his feelings about Unver, he was in no doubt how he felt about his brother Odrig, the Thane. He hated him. Odrig was one of the largest, fiercest men in the Crane clan. He had acted like its leader since he was a youth, but when their father Hervolt had been god-struck 7 summers earlier, Odrig had inherited the clan's bones and banner in fact, as well as in his own estimation. Hervolt still lived, but the old Thane was now little more than a simpleton. Odrig had ruled the family since that moment, and had made that hard old man, their father, seem like a soft, soft woman. Framer was no coward, and in a different clan he might have thrived, but his older brother treated him like a child. "No," he thought, "not like a child, like a dog. Kick me when he pleases, and throw me a bone if it suits him. If he were not my brother and my Thane, if he were simply another clansman, I would have put a knife in him years ago." Sometimes Framer thought of simply leaving the Crane clan for another, the Fitches, or Kestrels, or even the Antelopes up in the meadow Thriving, whom he had seen once at a gathering and admired for their tall, handsome women. Sometimes he even thought it would be better to wander unhomed and without a clan than to continue putting up with Odrig's abuse, but he could not leave their sister, Kolva, to suffer alone. It seemed strange to hate his own flesh and blood so, but time and again Odrig's stone fist had proved himself worth hating. They rode swiftly through the hills that hemmed the marshy lowlands, but paused before descending into the wide valley. The settlement stretching before them was mostly dark, but here and there a torch burned along the wooden stockade, and Framer thought he could see movement above the gate. Unver, as usual, rode a little way apart from the others, bent low over his saddle and wrapped in his long dark cloak, so that it was hard to tell by moonlight where horse ended and rider began. Odrig reined up and scanned the wall. Inside lay the paddocks, where the settlers' cattle and sheep were kept, along with the greatest prize of all, their horses. The stone-dwellers' beasts might not compare to Thriving steeds, but they were still useful for cross-breeding, and even more useful for selling to Varnamen and others who could not afford the prices at Nabanai horse markets. Odrig stood high in his stirrups, scanning the darkness. Much as he loathed him, Framer had to admit his brother had the look of a proper grasslands Thane. Odrig had taken a wife, as a Thane should, and had long ago grown out his man's beard. Unver and Trojan, despite being more or less the same age, still had the long mustaches and smooth chins of unmarried men, while Framer's own mustaches did not even reach the bottom of his jaw. "Where are Tunsdan and his damned cousins?" Odrig growled, but a moment later a nightjar's call echoed 3 times from the nearest hill. "There. Good." He bared his teeth in a grin. "Now we wait for Bordelm to start the celebration." He looked to Unver. "If this plan of yours doesn't work, be sure I'll leave you behind to be skinned by the city men." Unver only stared back at him as though the Thane hadn't said anything worth hearing. For long, tense moments, the Crane men sat and waited, motionless as stones. Then, along the far edge of the settlement, a great fire blossomed on the palisade. Suddenly the night was full of cries, both the shouts of Bordelm's clansmen and the cries of startled sentries at the tall wooden gates. Torches bounced along the top of the gate as the other guards rushed back and forth, trying to make out what was happening on the far end of the settlement. Odrig now lifted his horn to his lips and blew 3 short blasts, then dug in his spurs and set off down the hillside at a gallop, with Drojan and Unver just behind him. Framer clapped heels into his horse's ribcage and followed them. A larger force of mounted men were sweeping down from one of the other hillsides. Their cousin, Tunsdan, and his own sprawling family clan, more than a dozen Cranes, with a taste for plunder and violence. At Unver's suggestion, Bordelm and the others had brought buckets of pitch to smear along the palisade logs before setting the fire, and the scheme had clearly worked. As Framer and the others neared the settlement, the moonlight was outshone by the unsteady orange glare of the burning wall. Framer heard shouts and screams from inside the settlement as the stone dwellers woke to discover that something terrible was happening. Every now and then an arrow would fly from inside the walls, gleaming red for a moment in the firelight, but the Crane clansmen had arrows of their own, wrapped in pitchy rags. Within moments, dozens of flaming missiles were being shot back over the wall, starting fires and roof thatch all over the settlement. The clansmen quickly reached the gate in the high wall. The guards had deserted it to run toward the fire on the far side of the settlement. Unver climbed on top of his saddle, balancing with his arms spread. The moment his horse was close enough, he leaped up and caught the top of the gate, curling his fingers around 2 of the sharpened posts, then pulled himself over. A moment later, the bolt slid back and the gate opened. Odrig laughed. "See, they are inviting us in, my blood drinkers. Let us not shame their hospitality by refusing." Framer caught at the reins of Unver's black horse and led it through the gate. The tall man took it back without a word and vaulted back into his saddle, then spurred forward. Framer stayed close behind him. Inside, the settlement was ablaze. People were running all directions in disorganized terror, but it was easy enough to tell the mounted Thrithings-men from the Nabani settlers, who wore flapping nightshirts or were barely half-dressed. Some of the guards had never made it across to the burning wall on the far side of the settlement, and turned now to stand against Odrig and his raiders. As the smoke swirled, and the shrieks of women and children and the death cries of men rose into the night sky, these guards became the center of knots of resistance. The Cranes did not care. They did not intend to wipe out a settlement of many hundreds, not with less than 100 men of their own. Their goal was the fenced paddock at the center of the village, where the animals were kept. Framer had been on raids before, but never against such a large target. Before tonight, the men of the Crane clan had confined their attacks to isolated farmsteads or the lands of absent Nabani lords who seldom had enough men to protect their holdings from determined assaults. But this was a very different kind of strike, and Framer could not help wondering how Odrig would deal with the obvious success of Unver's idea. Odrig already disliked the tall, quiet man, who alone among the Cranes did not treat Framer's brother as his lord and master. Most of the clansmen were already headed toward the paddocks at the center of the settlement, but Odrig stopped to take on a Nabani settler who was intent on defending his village with a billhook. The settler had no armor and wore only a long shirt, but Odrig seemed to be enjoying the sport, slashing at the man's hands where he held his makeshift weapon and blocking the man's return swipes, laughing all the while. His brother laughed frequently, but Framer had learned early in his life that when Audrig was laughing, someone else was usually bleeding. Audrig now began inflicting cuts on the settler, slashing his face and arms so that the man's nightshirt was ribboned with blood. Fires had started in many other places throughout the settlement now, and smoke was spreading everywhere. "Come, mouse! Come, rabbit!" Audrig shouted to Fremer. "Take an ear or his nose for your own. A trophy!" Framer had always hated the names his brother gave him, little more than another way of calling him a weakling and coward, and he did not want to watch Audrig toying with the settler, who was now weeping and stumbling in the mud as Audrig inflicted cut after cut on him. Instead, he spurred away toward the center of the village. Much of the palisade was aflame now, and scores of roofs had been caught as well. Framer could hear the awful cries of those trapped in the burning houses, men, women, and children, but he felt no pity. This is our land, our fathers and their fathers. The Naban men should go back to their stone houses, or die. As he neared the center of the village, where the chaos of animal noises and human screams was at its loudest, Framer saw that a handful of his Crane clansmen had blundered down a passage between houses, and now were trapped against the inner wall of the palisade by a dozen or so settlers wielding billhooks and hay forks, as well as 2 or 3 armored settlement guards with long spears. It was impossible to make out the clansmen's faces in the smoky, inconstant light, but by the ribbons wrapping their horses' tails he guessed they might be some of Tunsdan's men. The Cranes were fighting desperately, but they were hemmed in, and the long spears of the guards were forcing them farther and farther back toward the wall. Framer hesitated for a moment. He owed nothing to Tunsdan, one of Audrig's chief allies, but these were still his clansmen. How could he hold his head up as a man if he abandoned them to these land-stealing farmers? He spurred toward the angry mob. Before he could reach them, though, a great shadow swept past him, like the grass thunderer himself. It was Unver on his black horse, Deafall, the curve of his sword a red crescent against the sky. The tall man crashed into the rear of the settlers, and several of them collapsed immediately, shoulders or necks fountaining blood. Others shouted in terrified surprise as their hunt of the clansmen fell into fatal disorder. It all happened so quickly that Framer slowed to watch as the cornered Cranes, heartened by their enemies' confusion, now plunged forward into the mass of settlers. The first to fall were the armored guards, and moments later the rest of the settlers were fleeing for their lives, while the Thrithing's men, changed from quarry back to hunters in mere moments, shouted and sang with joy at their rescue and rode the stragglers down. Unver stood in his stirrups and pointed with his sword toward the center of the town. "There!" he shouted at the clansmen. "Find your brothers there!" And in that moment, with the leaping red blaze silhouetting him against the night sky, illuminating Unver's sharp features and flapping cloak, so that he seemed half man, half raven, Framer felt something squeeze at his heart, a strange mix of admiration and terror. Surely this wasn't Unver any longer, but Tasdar, the anvil smasher himself, one of the powerful spirits worshipped by all the grassland clans. "What are you staring at, you fool?" the godlike figure shouted at him. "It is almost time to ride home." Framer realized with a start that Unver was right. Even Audrig would not wait much longer before retreating, not when they were so greatly outnumbered by the settlers. After all, this was not a killing mission, but a plundering mission. He also realized with a sinking heart that he was going to be returning from the raid empty-handed. He knew what Audrig and his cronies would say about that, and it would not be kind. Framer followed Unver as they rode toward the middle of the settlement, passing other clansmen driving the settlement's animals in small groups toward the gate. Here a crane with half a dozen bleating sheep, there a pair of cranes with several eye-rolling cattle. One of Bordelm's cousins clutched the harnesses of 2 heavy plow horses, which would never do as war beasts, but would serve admirably to pull a Thriving's wagon. As Unver and Framer burst into the open center of the village through screeching, heedless settlers and clansmen now eager to escape with their prizes, Framer saw that the paddock fences had been thrown down, broken into splinters in places, and that all but a few of the valuable animals were already gone. As he spurred after a squawking goose which hurried just ahead of him with its wings spread, he saw Unver dismount and then vanish into the shadowy doorway of a burning barn. He came out leading a huge bull, a magnificent creature with a rope hanging from its ringed nose. Unver's usually grim face wore a lopsided smile. "Even late to the feast, look what I've found," the tall man said. "And he was just about to overcook, too." Framer had never seen Unver look outright happy, not that he could remember. It was a strange sight, but even as he wondered at it, an arrow whizzed past his head and buried itself in a timber of the blazing barn. Some of the settlers still meant to fight back. Unver swung his long body back into the saddle in an instant, and he and Framer led the bull toward the front gate. Many of the settlers were fighting back in earnest now, with stones and the occasional bow and arrow, emboldened by the Thriving's men's retreat, and hoping to pick off a few as they rode by. Framer and Unver were not struck, but Framer saw one of Tunsdan's riders fall from his horse just a short distance away, an arrow in his leg. Before he could regain his saddle, he was dragged away into the shadows between houses by a mob of settlers. "Don't," Unver said as Framer hesitated. "It's too late for him. Ride now." Framer didn't have to be told twice. He and Unver were among the last to flee the settlement. Any moment now the gates would close and they would be trapped inside. Clansmen captured on raids were usually burned to death, and sometimes that was the most merciful part of their treatment. Framer laid his head against his horse's neck to offer a smaller target to any bowman. Finally, he saw the sagging gate before them. They went through at a trot, slowed by the trailing bull, and within moments the settlement began to fall away behind them, the smoke and flames and screams growing fainter with each hoofbeat, like a dream disappearing with morning light. "A good evening's work," said Unver, hunched low in his saddle, one hand still clutching the rope. The captive bull was being forced along at a pace far faster than it liked, lowing and snorting with discomfort. Unver was grinning, and again Framer was struck by the strangeness of seeing the man happy. "A good evening." They had reached the first rise, the walls of the settlement only a stone's throw behind them, when something struck Framer in the head like a lightning bolt. For a moment he had no idea of what up was or down, or of anything except that the night was full of bursting white stars. Then something like a giant hand stretched out and slapped him so hard the blazing white turned to solid black. When Framer could think again, he was lying on his back and could still see the flaming walls. His horse was gone. Unver was gone, and he was helpless. He tried to roll onto his stomach, but could only get halfway there. Blood. It must be blood, he thought, because it was wet and dark, dripped from his scalp, pooling on his hands and making the dark grass even darker. He lifted his head, which felt as though someone was beating it like a drum, and saw 3 figures running toward him from the settlement gate. "They shot me," was all he could think. "They shot me in the head with an arrow." He reached back. His helmet was gone somewhere, but although the back of his head was slick with blood and complicated with tattered, stinging flesh, he could not find the arrow he had been certain must be sticking into his skull. The settlers were getting closer, half running in their excitement at having brought down one of the hated raiders. Framer could see that they were Naban men, their upper lips shaved, their eyes bright with the excitement of revenge. One was already knocking a new arrow, while the other 2 carried billhooks. "They're going to cut me up like a spring lamb," Framer thought, and it was almost funny, except that his head hurt so badly. But I'm not a lamb, I'm a man. Then something dark leaped over him, all but flicking his face as it went, with a rumble and roar of air like a thundercloud punishing the earth. It was a horse, rider low on its neck, but now the rider rose in his stirrups and lifted his curved blade, bright and deadly as a lightning flash. Then it all faded, and Framer could no longer see anything, though he could hear men's voices shouting, some screams. Darkness was returning. Was he dying? Had some of the other clansmen come to help him? Framer didn't know, but he could not imagine that any of it mattered very much. And that is where we are going to stop, since it is now 2 o'clock. And let me get rid of that. And so, as always, I thank you for joining me. I will be back at 7 p.m. later today, and where we will continue with the adventures of Framer and Unver and the rest of the Crane clan. I don't think we're going to get to the Stallion clan for quite some time yet, but we will certainly get to them too. But we do have more of the Crane clan coming. Clan Cradney, or Cradney. Can't remember how that's pronounced in Thriving's tongue. I used to know these things back when I originally made up such of the Thriving's tongue as I did. It's not really made up, but it's kind of a shift. It's a linguistic shift from the Anglo-Saxon derivation of the Erkenlandish language, because the idea is that the Erkenlanders and the Thrivings people were all once one group, and the ones that settled down became the Erkenlanders, and the ones that continued their nomadic lifestyle were the Thrivings folk. So if you look at the names and the occasional bits of language in the books, you will see that there is a similarity, but there are some consonant shifts between Erkenlandish and the Thrivings speech. Anyway, that's the end of that commercial. Again, I bid you farewell. Lovely to see you all, as usual, virtually. And I will see you tomorrow. So be good to yourselves. Be good to your loved ones and family and friends and the people around you. And together we will all muddle through somehow. And that's a promise. Okay, thanks. And peace. And see you later.